This is the SL4000B, the desk that started it all, which we launched in 1978. Now there were there were quite a few clever things about this, but two I wanted to point out really. The first is that this was the first desk that acted as a remote control for a tape machine. Now that might not sound like a very big deal, but instead of having had a very big and very expensive 24-track remote that you wheel around, the desk had record arm and record ready buttons across the top of it, so it worked integrated with your recording medium. The other thing is, if you look very much at the top of the screen here, there's a tiny 6.5-inch CRT screen, and it had an integrated computer, so you could send the desk time code and it would record the moves you made on your faders against that time code, and actually all the mutes as well. So much like with Pro Tools today, you've got a mix window and an edit window. With a desk like this, you've got an arrange page where you draw your automation and you've got all your tape things, and so it's kind of the same principle. Then in 1983 and 1981, we brought out Total Recall. And we actually marketed this as a way to not have to do locking out your studio ever again, because you could do night sessions as well as day sessions, because you could recall all your kit. Of course, it didn't quite work out like that, and everyone suddenly said, well, hang on a minute, I can record something in London and then take it to New York and mix it, just like you do with a Logic session today. So that's, 30 years ago, that common transparency of the session compatibility. This is the SO1, which is a product not a lot of you will probably know. It was our first digital console. It didn't really work. It had a massive big PCB, literally it's about this sized, and to make digital things then you had to have so many chips. The weight of the DSP chips made the circuit board bow in the middle and all the solder joints got broken. However, the control surface worked fantastically, and this was an 8-track recorder mixer with dedicated EQ controls, dedicated dynamics controls, dedicated transport controls, much like the control surfaces we're all using today, but this was from 1988, before anyone else was doing them. AWS, we launched that in 2004. It was the first analog desk to also be a control surface in the same footprint. The idea when we designed this was that we saw loads of people were mixing in the box in Pro Tools and they'd need something to control that, but they'd need a small front end to go with their system. So it was designed as a tracking desk that you could do your session on, get it into Pro Tools, then take your session somewhere else. Obviously then people start thinking, I'm sat in front of an AWS, there's an SSL mixer here, why am I mixing in the box? So it's kind of broken out that way. So over the course of the years, we've been one of the first, if not the first, in each of these categories to do these things. So a lot of the workflow that you have in your DAW has been inspired by, shall we say, what SSL have done in the past. But we're quite lucky about what we do. And we get to go to lots of cool studios or see lots of producers and talk about kit, which isn't a bad job, let's face it. But everywhere I go, I always ask the same question, because I think it's quite interesting. And it's one that we don't often think enough about. And that is, why do you work that way? Now, quite often I'll get one of two answers. Number one is, I've always worked this way, or I don't know. And because the pressure that we have on us to turn sessions around quick, to do 4 or 5 mixed recalls in a day, as a working engineer, you're kind of petrified to do anything different because it will slow your workflow down. It might change your sound, which is what someone's booking you for in the first place. And so you don't often give yourself enough time to sit down and go, well, how can I make all this better? Just the idea of having a spare day where you could change something, where you don't have to have a session in to pay for it's quite a big deal. Now, we get to go and see lots of studios where we ask this question every time. It could be a little thing, a little in the box with a laptop, a couple of screens. We all know what that looks like. It could be more of a hybrid studio. Now, on the left here, this is a chap called Simon Gray, very, very good jazz funk keyboard player. He plays with real people, he plays with Incognito. And you can see that he's got his mouse and his keyboard right in front of him. He's got 2 big screens. Just off to the right, he's got a little selection of outboard that he puts on his master bus when he's tracking. And in a similar setup, this is the studio of Dave McEwen and Eric Apapule, who did the deformation of Strickland Banks for Bmw. This is down in Battersea. And you can see it's a similar kind of rig. There's a keyboard, a trackball, bit of outboard on the sides, 2 big screens, and we'll come back to that setup later. But that's a very common working studio now, a producer's own studio. We also see some crazy people. This is a chap from Australia who's ever so nice, but really wanted to have all of his stuff available and recallable electronically whenever he wanted. And I think the interesting thing about this picture is the little summing desk he's got at the bottom is held on his old mixing desk as a shelf, basically. But he's got 5 of our kind of recallable patch bays to put it all in. And, that's a pretty defined workflow, but it's a very individual workflow. These two studios, again, a similar kit, but very, very different workflows. On the left is a very nice bloke, so you have to forgive the kind of Hannibal Lecter-esque picture. His name's Luke Smith, and he's done a lot of work with Mute Records and Depeche Mode and Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and people like that. But you can see in front of his desk, he's got a keyboard, he's got a mouse, he's got a screen in the middle. And then on one side, he's got a whole bunch of modular synths, and on the other side, he's got a whole bunch of 500 series stuff. When you look at this, which is eStudio, is a commercial studio in Sweden, they've got a bunch of outboard, a mixing desk in the middle, but again, a keyboard, a mouse in the middle, a big screen on top of them. Even with the same kind of kit, these people are doing very, very different workflows. And then you get these ones, it's kind of nice. That's a little room just off Tom Rowland's kitchen. And if you're an analog synth geek like me, then it's quite a cool place. Hands up anyone who'd like that as their own home studio. Me, please. But all of these people, all of these different workflows, the same question comes up. Why do you work that way? And I think it's something that's quite important for us to think about. Now, what I'm not going to talk about in this session is keyboard shortcuts or choice of DAWs, because that can be confusing if it's not your DAW or it's not the way that you work. Now, we'll touch on some of the specific stuff about that later. But what we are going to look at is 3 different factors that affect the way that we work and affect our workflow. And these are physical factors, emotive factors, and cognitive factors. And none of them involve what DAW you're using. Let's move on to the physical to start with. This, of course, is Vitruvian Man, known by Da Vinci to define the height of a man as equal to the width of his arms. What you may not know is that Da Vinci actually invented the windmill, and Pete Townsend stole it. But the purpose of this is to talk about our bodies. Now, when you look at a studio around you, the ergonomics experts will tell you to divide it into 2 areas: repetitive reach and occasional reach. Now, there's 2 ways you can look at this. Repetitive reach is things you touch all the time, and occasional reach is things you touch some of the time. Or the science, the biomechanics behind that. For the repetitive reach, you have to be able to reach it with your elbows tucked into your body. So it's where your keyboard is, where your mouth is. It's the minimum effort required to do frequent tasks. The occasional reach, you can see the arms going forward, it's when the ball of the shoulder rotates forwards. So as you go like that, you feel the shoulder going. We all know this feeling for hours over a mixing desk and then having a bad neck when we get home. And the idea is that you should have all the stuff you touch all the time in the repetitive reach zone, and the stuff you touch some of the time where you have to do more effort to do it. Now, we'll put this into a real world context. This is the Sanctuary Studios again, Dave and Eric's place. And if we overlay the concept of repetitive reach and occasional reach onto it, then when you actually look at the measurements, the repetitive reach is between kind of 12 and 18 inches, so 30 and 45 centimetres from the body. And you can see in that zone they have the transport control, the trackball and the keyboard. So this tells us a lot of their work is in the box, which should be no surprise to any of us these days. However, when you look at the occasional reach stuff, you can see they've got their mic pre's, their channel strips, and their monitor controller is out here. Despite the fact that they have 3 sets of monitors, there's a little pair of Grot boxes here, there's NS10s and some big PMCs. So even though they've got the 3 of those, if their monitor controller's over there, they probably don't switch them very often. You can tell a lot about these guys' workflow from this picture. There's 2 big screens in the front with a webcam in the middle, so they probably do a lot of remote sessions. There's a drive caddy on the right, so they can just slot things in and work and slot them out and work. And when you look at the way that this has been set up, it's very much about workflow and also ergonomics. Now, this also comes into product design for us. Now, got one of our control surfaces here, and the idea of this is that if you want to use it with a keyboard, the height at the front of it is exactly the height of a standard PC keyboard, which are taller and uglier than Mac ones. And if you are using it with a keyboard, then you don't need the programmable soft keys for keyboard shortcuts. So the faders, the pans, the solos and cuts are all in the repetitive reach zone, and the clever programmable soft keys are in the occasional reach zone. However, if you're going to program those keys up, you're not going to need a keyboard, and even the extreme pan pots of channel 1 and 16 are in your repetitive reach zone. So it's not about your studio space, it's also about the stuff you're putting into that space. I went to do a setup for someone who had a Nucleosoft to the left of them, and they were showing this stuff they were doing with Omnisphere, and he says, yeah, I'm always doing this parameter, and he's going like this. I'm like, why don't you just put that parameter on the closest knob? And we worked it out. He reached for that parameter about 20 or 30 times a day. It might only take 2 seconds, but that's a minute added up of just reaching. And he said, well, I could move it to the right hand end, but that's the only exercise I get, so I'm just going to leave it. There's also physical factors about the way that our bodies are programmed to work, and this is about biomechanics, which is some of the, we quite like thinking about it. There are 4 ways that your hands work. The first is called a power grip, which is the back tips of your fingers against your palm, like you're squeezing a ball or opening a jar. Then there's a precision grip, which is the tips of your fingers against your thumb, if you're a monkey picking fleas out your hair or what have you. The hook grip, which has obviously been devised for carrying, and the scissor grip, which hasn't just been invented for smokers, but also if you think of grooming hair and plaiting hair, you can keep it out the way with 2 fingers while still doing things with the other. And there are reasons why our bodies have evolved over the years that it's been advantageous for us for our hands to work in these 4 modes. Now this is kind of a vision of the future. It's a whole bunch of touchscreens. Touchscreens are great. You can have one in your pocket and it does everything, and it can be buttons. But think about the ways that your fingers actually work on a touchscreen. It does this or it does that. And the screen itself isn't actually a particularly good interface for the way that our hands work. It's convenient and it's quick, but it doesn't give us any biomechanical feedback. We expect to touch something or feel resistance against it. And so thinking about the way that you expect to do things, little things like just nudging up a fader, it's really easy to do with a physical fader. It's a bit more difficult to do on a touchscreen, especially one that's really latent. So thinking about not only your studio space, not only the ergonomics of your body, but the ergonomics of your hands are quite important. Anyone who's a Pro Tools user, we know that you've got to get into sort of RSI-inducing crabs to do a lot of the keyboard shortcuts. That's not an efficient use of our hands. This is the most successful control surface ever, and it's not evolved for 700 years. It's a piano keyboard. It might seem like I'm talking the blindingly obvious here, but look at the way those person's hands are moving and the expression that a great pianist can put into that control surface. Now, if you compared that to what you can do with modern technology, you wouldn't expect anyone to be doing Rachmaninoff second off one of them. Although I'm sure Apple will do an advert with someone playing Rachmaninoff second off an iPad. I also want to talk about the emotive setup. And when I say the emotive setup, emotive factors, I mean the way that things make you feel, which can have a really big impact on productivity. Now, I could talk quite a lot about this, but instead I've got a really nice little video, which was done by Mike Skinner, The Streets, who has a nice big SSL. But he did a really, really nice little thing, which I think explains it better than I could. And he said that he read a thing once where a travel writing legend said that the secret to travelling is that whatever displeasing situation you might find yourself in, you can always make yourself more comfortable. Find a nicer angle in your seat. Put your head near a breezy window. Pull on another pair of socks. And you might find that it works. Taking care of your immediate sensation can turn your head into a different space. Now Mike's a lucky boy. He's got quite a nice studio at home. He went on a bit of a splurge and kitted it out with all the nice stuff. So he's got big boxes of joyous, harmonically distorting glassware. Stuff that's going to put the heat into his sound, the vibe into his sound, that slurs the transient information. it heated up his music. And it heated up his room. Hundreds of valves that he put in there, in a soundproof room. Right effects come in. Similar to the main function of the boiler room of a ship. He always used to think that his comfort was less important as his engineering. But he said it started to get silly. And it was like trying to make beats in the engine room. So he called in the sales experts, if you don't mind me paraphrasing, and he stumped for a dose of refrigeration. And he says it's amazing how a stable temperature of 23 degrees centigrade has affected his work, his music, and his creativity. So he suggests to us all we should think about making ourselves just that little bit more comfortable. Now, whenever I play that video in like LA or Thailand or southern Japan, everyone is completely incongruous as to the idea of a room that doesn't have air conditioning. But the point is that, you know, he spent all that time, energy and money buying racks and racks of what he thought he wanted, and it turned his studio into a place that he didn't want to be in. And so when we talk about the way a space makes you feel and how it can affect your creativity, it's really quite big. Now, there are some very well documented examples of this in the business world. Who's heard of sick building syndrome? It's a dull topic, but I like dull topics. On the right of the screen, we have a typical call centre, styly, rabbit hutch cubicle room. And many companies have found that rooms like this lead to higher levels of staff illness and absenteeism, and also have reported that productivity isn't terribly good. Now, on the other side, this is a bank's headquarters in London. It's an Australian bank, and they thought that everything that went on in their building was in secret meeting rooms, and no one ever knew what was going on. And so they've made all meeting rooms open. They all have at least one window facing into a common atrium. So you can walk through the building, and instead of being a faceless series of doors, you can see what's going on in there. Now, there are two buildings that are really good examples of how this stuff can affect productivity. Loath as I am to admit it, one of them is from Microsoft, their headquarters in Holland. They went on a design mission with it, and they put hot desking in and lots of different zones and different colour schemes and different chairs, and allowed people to work from home more often. And they found that productivity increased by 25%. Another award-winning one is the Bmw Factory in Munich. I don't know if any of you have seen pictures of it. It's cool as hell. They take the production line and it goes through the accounts department and through the purchasing department, and there's cars going up the side of walls and stuff. But everyone who worked there could then see why they were working there and what they were working for, and they found productivity increased by 20% for being in a nicer environment. Now, if I said to you, you could change the way your setup was and then give yourself Fridays off every week, or change the way you do your setup and then still work Fridays but do 25% more work and therefore earn 25% more money, would you think about changing the way the space around you feels, how it motivates you to work? So we can talk about physical factors, how our bodies work, how the studio works, how space makes us feel. There is another really big factor in the way we work, and these are cognitive factors, the way we think, the way that the brain works. Now, some of these are a little bit left field, and some of these have been disproved by modern neuroscience, but the principles are coolly there. We used to think that the two hemispheres of the brain, the left brain and the right brain, were largely responsible for creativity and language and thought on the right side, and then straight line thinking, maths, logic on the left side. Now, over the last few years, we've actually proved that a lot of those happen in the frontal cortex rather than the hemispheres, but there is some processing about the way our brain works. There's a reason why left-handed people tend to be a bit more creative than right-handed people. I mean, if you've all been in studios and around musicians, you'll know there are more lefties than would normally be in an office, for example, or if you work with painters or videographers and things. Some people think it's because the right side of the brain, which is the creative side of the brain, is the one that controls their dominant hand. So me being right-handed, my dominant hand is controlled by the left side of my brain, and anyone who's left-handed, it's controlled by the right side of your brain. And some people think that because of that, you know, if you're trying to be creative, you can do this one way, or you're trying to be logical, you can do this another way. I mean, you've all heard the thing that, you know, if the phone rings and you pick it up and you talk to someone for 3 minutes, it will take you 20 minutes to get back to the rhythm that you were just at before the phone went off. And this is the same kind of thing. It's the different hemispheres of thought. Now, I'm going to give you an equation that makes no sense. It's mouse plus screen equals juggling. Now, there's a reason for saying this. When you're using a mouse, you're moving your hand down here and looking at a screen. So you're moving your hand without looking at it. So your brain thinks, this is hand-eye coordination. This is a logical function. So therefore it will be processed by the left side of my brain. And in fact, when you're juggling, if anyone's learnt to juggle, what they'll tell you to do is imagine a square in front of you with your two hands in the bottom corners, and then throw the ball up so it touches the top of the square in the middle, and just look at the top of your square, not your hands. It's exactly the same process as your body's concerned as using a mouse. So that's a left brain function, which is not the creative side of your brain. And this is that every time you pick up a mouse and look at a screen, it's a bit like that phone going you and distracting you from the thought that you had. Because you have to shift your brain from presumably what is a creative mode when you're mixing and you want to have ideas come, into a more logical thinking mode. So you start to put up barriers against the way you work. You know, this is all subconscious, but when you start doing it a different way, you realise it becomes easier. Now, and thankfully I think a few people in the room are old enough to remember the concept of playing a mix, of having 4 or 5 people stood along the desk and hurling the aux sends, or doing some regenerative delays, coming back on the desk and doing 4 or 5 takes and then saying which verse of which you like best and then splicing it together. And it seemed so much more fun making music then. Whereas now you sit in front of a screen and you look at lines and you program where things are. And yes, it's all accurate, but you don't get any happy mistakes. Some of the best things I've ever done in mixes are ones that I didn't plan and just threw in and it happened to work. And we miss the concept of happy accident by over-programming, by using our eyes too much when we're mixing. You know, Brian Eno and the Oblique Strategies talked quite a lot about this sort of thing, if anyone's into it. This is our boss. He's a very nice bloke. His name's Peter. It's what he used to look like. Really. I could have chosen the fox, I could have chosen Little Red Riding Hood. Thankfully he does look like this now, and we're very lucky to have him, the very creative statesman of music. This is his home studio. It's rather nice. Actually, it's not his home studio, because he's got one of them down the road here when he's in London, but that's his kind of other studio. And the big room at Real World is lovely. If you've not been in there, it's the bottom of this window is at the level of the duck pond outside, the old mill pond, and there's some glass bricks on the floor where the mill stream goes under the live room. But one thing Peter's really into is kind of getting the vibe in the recording. And what you don't see is at this end of the picture there's a little stage about 1 foot high, and there's no separation between the engineer and the musicians, because Peter wanted it to be, you know, a big feeling of communal energy as you make this music together. And I think that that reflects a little bit on his way of doing things, which he's called Alpha and Zen, which you could think of as logical and creative. So what he'll do is he'll get everyone in the room and he'll set the tape rolling and they'll jam and they'll have ideas and they'll feed off each other and try some stuff, and they just keep going and keep going and keep going until they run out of ideas. Then they put their instruments down and they say, right, well, we're not in Zen mode anymore, we're not being creative, I want to analyse what I've just done. And they will sit down with the tapes and go through everything and say, well, I like that, or that chord progression's wrong, or could we try that with a different sound, and try and do all the analytical decisions behind it. And when they run out of analysis that they think they've done, they pick their instruments up again, and then they have some ideas that vibe off the stuff they've just done, and they keep going until the ideas have run out, and then they go back into alpha mode and analyse those ideas. Now this could be, well, why Peter takes so long to make an album. That could be for various other reasons, like his quality threshold. But I think what's interesting about this is he tries to very deliberately separate when he's trying to be creative and when he's trying to be analytical and engineering focused. Now, in a practical everyday session of you have a singer coming in to do overdubs and put BVs on in the chorus and you're going to churn them out in 2.5 hours, you may not have the time to sit there and say, do you know what, let's see what we can be creative with this, or give me 20 minutes just to get this right. You know, you've got it in. But you might be tempted when you've done a good vocal take to say, let me just have a couple of minutes to process that. And you put the EQ and the compressor on, and then you get into delay a bit, and before you know it, 5 or 6 minutes have gone past. And that singer's been sat in the vocal booth going cold, doing nothing, just when they'd nailed a brilliant take. At which point you should have said, let's do the BVs now, and I'll process it later. So in the way of taking these creative boundaries or these logical blocks away from the creative process, or inserting logical blocks where it makes most sense to, thinking of your workflow in terms of when do you want to be creative and when do you want to be analytical is quite helpful. Going back to the old model of having a tracking session and a mixing session, one that was all about getting the sounds right and recording well, and one that was about mixing what we've just got recorded well. And you all have to mix and produce and overdub and write all at the same time, which means your workflow's always going to have some intrinsic barriers into it. And a little bit of smartness can allow you to move them. So I know a lot of that's a bit left of field, but I thought before we talk about keyboard shortcuts and what this particular product can do, a general idea about workflow and other ways of thinking of it might be a nice little starting point. We tried to sum it up in just a few simple things. Some of them are blindingly obvious and you'll think me foolish for saying them to you. But ask yourself when you last did them, because you probably haven't for a long time, because that's the way you've always worked. I don't know why I work that way. Make a note of the things you use most and then move them closest to you. I know that sounds really stupid, but if you have to reach over there for your monitor controller, it's in the wrong place. That's going to be costing you time and energy. Put it somewhere sensible. It's one close to my heart and hopefully close to all of your hearts as owners of a product that can do this kind of thing. Make a note of the 10 keyboard shortcuts you use most often and reassign them to a single key. Why are you going Control, Option, Backspace, Shift when you could just do F1? That's another little incremental gain you can get into your workflow. And you don't have to think, oh, hold on, Control, Option, Shift, this one, that one. Press a button. You're removing one of those logical blocks. Identify when you want to be creative and when you want to be technical. That doesn't necessarily mean always act upon it, because it might not be practical at that moment. But being aware of when your head's going through those processes is probably quite a useful thing. I like this one. What works best when you play it and what works best when you program it? If you're going to put a drum loop in that's going to go ats, ats, what's easier? Going on a keyboard or sitting there with a mouse and a drum grid like this, which you're then going to quantize anyway to put a bit of swing on it? Why don't you just play it with a bit of swing? I did a session with someone years and years and years ago and had a really nice kind of shaker on the side of it. Quantizations on that shaker's really nice. What'd you do with that? He just picked up a shaker and went in front of a microphone. I felt about this big, obviously. But it was a great groove. Forgive me, RTFM. I shall have to censor myself because we have cameras again. But for those that don't know, it's read the flipping manual. You are absolutely in the lap of luxury. You get more on 140 quid bit of software on one of these things than you ever used to get in a whole building like this. How much of it do you actually know? You might be doing something in a certain way that your software can do it for you in 1/10 of the time. Or you might not be using a feature on the box that you've got that would be brilliant for you because you never found out that it's got it. Just scrolling through presets makes you sound like everybody else. One of the things that all the top producers will tell you is to get it out and do it differently. You know, take a virtual instrument and run it through an amp with a 57 on the cone. You know, run a signal through a beaten up old speaker with an amp through it. Use some crusty old analog delay you bought off eBay for 30 quid because no one else has got them. Knowing the stuff you own is far more powerful than buying more stuff. Plus, it saves our support, so please read the manual. This might sound a bit sucky. It's not meant to be. Buy from companies who understand how you work. Now, in the case of a matrix, for example, it's a fairly substantial amount of money. Now, you're not going to want to buy that from someone who doesn't know the product well, can't tell you what cables you're going to need to go with it, can't tell you how it's going to integrate with the rest of your studio, can't point you to where all the useful videos are for you to use it better, can't invite you down to the SSL factory for a tour one afternoon. Hi, Gary. People who don't understand that your job is to turn stuff around quickly, making it sound as good as you can, but to have an edge over everyone else because you're doing it a bit different. You want to work with people who understand what you're doing. So this isn't just about SSL is a brilliant company or buy from this retailer or that retailer, but buy from someone who understands how you work and why you're doing it that way. Otherwise you won't get good advice. And the internet's a wonderful thing, but it's full of people that wouldn't know good advice if it punched them in the face. I'm one of them. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about in terms of workflow. Like I say, I know it's a bit esoteric in some places, but there's a lot of stuff that you can do when you get home that makes it more fun to go to work. It makes you finish an hour earlier every day. That gives you a better sonic result for no extra effort. And buying yourself a bit of time to look at that or think about that or draw a couple more diagrams of how the wiring could go and things is worth your time.